Alright, welcome to part 3 of our build tutorial. We're going to crack straight in today and finish off the placement of build items. So we're going to start with the data. So if you go to the data asset that we set up last time, we're going to add a bit more data that we need for our build placement. So the first things we're going to need is we're going to need some class references. So I'm going to use two. There's different ways you can set this up, but I'm going to use two different classes. So one will be a build class and one will be the final build class. And I'm going to show you how you can use a blueprint for these, just a generic blueprint, and then modify it with the data asset. We're going to have another array. Oh, by the way, they're soft class pointers. So I'll show you how to load those, similar to how we did it last time. And then I'm going to have an array of soft object pointers, which will be the static meshes. So this will be whatever meshes you have for your build sequence. So as the building progresses through its build stages, set it up so you can just have as many meshes as you like in there, and it will just adapt to progress through those at certain stages of the build progression. So like a number from 0 to 1. What else are we going to need in here? We're going to need a static mesh for when their build's complete. So this will be the generic blueprint, and this will be what the actual static mesh is of your final build object. And then we'll need a reference to our material. So that'll be if you haven't seen the tutorial on the overlay material, that's what we're going to use here for the, when you can and can't place stuff. So that'll be the place material there. So now we'll go to our build data. So we're going to add another enum and a struct here. We just want another enum for our build state. So we're going to use this to just detect if we're in the process of building, it's complete, or we're aborting. And then we're going to add a struct. You can call this struct whatever you like. I couldn't really think of a good name, to be honest, but generally when you place these things, you're going to want to interact with them later, and if you're playing multiplayer, you're going to want both players to be able to interact with it. So if one player builds something, you want to have a central repository for all stuff that's like selectable or whatever. So like, and different things will happen based on if you're the owner of that selectable. I'm just sort of doing a little example here of how you'd do that. So when it's placed, it'll then update. I'll have it on the game state, and I'm just using this struct rather than just saving an object and not knowing who owns it. I mean, you could store it on the object itself, and that's probably the best way to do it. But this allows you to get lists of items. So I could get all buildings owned by a player, or you can put more data in this struct to filter by. What's the type of building, and you can just hit those lists and extract all resource type buildings or something like that owned by this player. One method, not the only method. So let's go ahead and create a game state, because I don't think we have one yet. We just haven't had a need for one before. So I'm going to put this in the framework. We want the game state base. I'm just going to call sGameState as usual. So we're going to want to add that struct, like we said, to an array of data. So let's put a variable in for that. It'll just be an array of that struct. We need to include our game data, or build data, sorry. This will actually need to be replicated out, and then we'll need to add the get replicated time props for replication, and then we'll add the replicated object, which will be this. Or I copied it from the build component, obviously. But it needs to be the game state class, and the game state class here, and it's going to be our placed objects. And we'll just include the Unreal Network, and that is all replicated now. So we need to set replicates to true, and that's all we need in the game state for now. So we probably should ensure that this happens on the server, because when you update a replicated variable, it needs to be updated from the server, otherwise it won't replicate. So we might just change this up a bit. So I'm going to want a view function. I'm going to make this the RPC. And the way I usually do RPCs is I just have the same function name, but I just stick server or client or whatever the RPC is in the front. Yeah, we'll just kind of move this over to the CPP. So we'll use this one every time we want to update, and this will just send it to the server. Even if it's on the server, we can do this, and it will just ensure that it's updated from the server. Move this down, and usually you'll have something in here like, I mean, it's an RPC to the server, but it's just good practice to check that you have authority, which I like to do mine knots. Doesn't have authority. Return. There we go. That's it for that. So we can close the game state. Won't be adding to that in this tutorial again. We're done with the build data. We're done with the data overall. So now we've got to create what I'm just calling the buildable class. So there'll be the class that gets placed or spawned into the world when you want to build something. So it's the generic class I was talking about. So we're going to put that into the build folder, and it's just going to be an actor. I'm just going to call it buildable. There's going to be a fair bit to this class, so just be aware. So straight away, I know I'm going to be using the data, so I'm just going to put the include in for because we'll need access to that struct and stuff, and the enums. So we'll just do a reference to the build data there. And then in the protected section, we're going to need a few variables here. So we'll need the usual one. We'll need the asset manager. We're going to need a reference to data. So this will be the data that we send to it to tell it what type of buildable it is, including the include for that. We're going to need a static mesh component and a box collider component. So that this is we used for the. So I might put this in private. So the box collider will be used to detect whether it's placeable or not, and the mesh is obviously the mesh that we're going to update from our data as it builds. We're going to need a build progression variable, so as it builds along. This is what will upgrade and change the mesh. I'm just doing the build on a timer, so if you want to do it on someone's bringing resources, then you probably won't need a timer, but you can put it in anyway. You just don't need to use it if you're going to do it a separate way. If you're not sure on how to modify that or do a different way, just do it this way, and then you'll see how you can easily change it. And then what we want to do is we want to have a variable for the build state. So that's that enum that we just added, and I'm going to just default that to no build. All right, so now we need some functions to handle all this. The first thing probably going to want to do is initialize our data. So I'm just going to call it a init, and this will be passing in our data and the state of a build. And if there's no state passed in, I'm just setting it to default no build. So we can update the data without, setting it as a build or whatever using this function. So in here, we just want to check that our build data is valid. And if it is, we're going to update our build state and our build data variables that we just plugged in. Based on what build state is passed in, we need to do some things. So the first one would be if the state is building, then we want to start building. So let's add a start build function and an end build function. Now, if we're not in a build state, then we're probably going to be in the preview state. So we're previewing we're getting ready to place the build, hasn't deployed the build yet. So we're going to want to initialize the preview of the build. And I could actually make these protected. Sorry, I'm going to make these down here. So we want to initialize the build preview. I'll put this at the start. So in the init build preview, this is where we'll set the preview static mesh. So this will be, you actually want to set the completed static mesh on the object. So first thing I'm going to do is my usual checks for whatever I'm using. So I'm going to check if the mesh is valid, the data is valid, and the box collider is valid. If they're not, I'm not going to do anything. And then we're going to, from our data, we need to load our completed. If we go back to our data, we have this completed mesh, and this is what we'll use as the preview. So this is when you're going to place it, you show the final build, and then when you place it, it goes to the, like a dirt patch or whatever when you start your build. So we need to get that static mesh from our data. So that's why we're checking the data is valid, and the include for our data. And then we're just going to do a load synchronous because it's just a single static mesh, so it'll be nice and quick. And then we'll set that mesh on our mesh. And then because this build mesh could be anything, we need to update the collider to match the mesh that we're putting in. So we're going to need a function to update our collider, our collision parameters basically. So I'm just going to put that in here. So before we go building out the collider there, we'll just make sure we're calling to that first. So in our init build preview, we want to call that update collider to change the shape. And then the other thing we want to do is set our overlay material so we get the visualization of whether it can be deployed or not. So we'll just create a function for that. And we'll call that in there as well. Now before we go on, we'll just come back to where we were. So the init, if the build state is building, we want to start the build like we said. Otherwise, we're going to do a preview, and we probably could have a build state of preview, but at the moment I'm just anything that's not a build state or a board or whatever to do with building, it's a preview, as I don't have anything else. So in there, we'll call that a init build preview, and in the build state, so if we pass in a state of building, we're going to start the build. So let's start in the start build. So the first thing we want to do is reset our build progression, make sure it's not set for some reason. And then we want to set our build progression mesh. So we just want to make sure that we're using the first mesh in that array that we have in our data. So we're going to call an update build progression mesh function, which I'll add to here as well. We'll fill these out in a sec. I just want to get all these. We'll just go through it from start to finish, or we're going to miss stuff. So now this is where to start the build. For me, we're going to start the timer. So if this would be where you might enable resource drop off or something like that if you're doing it that way. But so we're going to start a timer, and it's just going to be looping, and it's just for demonstration purposes. It's going to build every 2 seconds, and I've got a 2-second delay, so it doesn't just immediately change to the second one. So we're going to need an update build progression function, which is what will be called every time lapse. And on the start of build, we'll just, in case we end up calling it from somewhere else or something, we'll just ensure that our build state is building. It should already be that, but if this is, later on as you add to it, you might be calling this from something else or something like that. So covers that. So let's do end build now. So the first thing we want to do is stop the timer. So that timer we started in start build, we want to end that. And then we want to, if the build didn't complete and we've for some reason called end build, then we're going to class that as an abort. So we'll set our build state to abort. And then we want to have an event that we can call back to whatever we need to when the build is finished. So this will probably be a UI update, or in this case, it's probably going to go back to our build component, right? So let's add a delegate for that. In that delegate, we'll pass the build state. Just doing a dynamic multicast delegate again, and we're going to pass that in build state, so that it'll send back whether we're completed, aborted, or still building even. So then we just want to add that as public, so something can bind to that, subscribe to that, and then in that end build, we'll call this broadcast. We'll let anything know, and we'll pass our build state. Right, for our update collider, first thing I'm going to do is check that we actually have a valid mesh and box collider, what we'll be referencing. We want to get the bounds of our mesh that we've assigned, and then we're going to set the box collider's extent. So here I'm just, we need a reference to a box uninclude, sorry. So for this, we're going to set the maximum of either 100 or whatever the bound of the mesh is, plus 10. So we should never have a box that's less than 100. Like you might not want to adjust this. I just didn't want a box of 0. So this is just giving it a bit of padding so you can't put things exactly on each other. There'll be a bit of spacing. So adjust these numbers. You could even make these variables in your buildable if you want to have, configurable buildable. You could even put these figures in the data asset and have them as configurable things for each buildable. The options are there. And just putting this update overlaps to true, so if this changes and it's already over something, it'll update. And then we'll just set our rotation to be forward. I'm not handling rotation in this tutorial, so We're just going to put that to X is forward, and that's the rotation of our box collider. We'll look at adding rotation some other time. Righto, so for our set overlay material, we're going to need to check if the data is valid, because we're going to get the overlay material from there. And to get the, so if we go to our data, so we need to load this material instance, and then we need to create a dynamic material so we can update the parameters. I'll leave a link to the overlay material tutorial in the description. That's probably one other variable we're going to need here. We're going to need a variable for our dynamic mesh. So I'm just going to put that there. Dynamic overlay material so we can update the parameters. So the way that we load a material from a soft object pointer is we get the soft object path, and then we attempt to load that from the path using the try load function there. So that's going to give us our material instance. So then we want to create a dynamic material instance from that. And if that is valid, then we want to go ahead and set our dynamic material instance onto our static mesh, like so. So next is our update build progression mesh. So we're going to need to access our data and the mesh again, check that they're valid. We're going to calculate what mesh we need from the array. So this is what will give us an index to that array based on how many meshes are in the array and what our build progression actually is. And then we're just going to check that that's actually a valid index in the array, in case we've got some reason got out of scope there and got a null index or something like that. And then we need to get that mesh from our data and load that mesh into memory so we can use it. And then we just apply that to our mesh. All right, for our build progression here, we need to update that. So we want to basically one for each of the build meshes as it ticks along. So every 2 seconds it's going to add, I don't know what, it'll depend how many meshes they are. So like 0.2 or something, or it's going to change based on it's basically dividing one up into an equal amount based on how many meshes we have. And then if the build progression is greater than equal to 1, that means we've finished. So we can then load our completed mesh from the data and apply that to the mesh on the object, and we can set our build state to complete, and we can just end build. I don't have a check for a mesh, so I'm going to put that up top. If you wonder why I do these checks at the top rather than do like if mesh and then have the code in here, if you want to search for a video on YouTube called Never Nester, that's probably the best way to describe why I do that. It just stops you ending up with all these nests of if statements in a long line. Like obviously in this case it'd be 1 or 2, but I just prefer this method of anything that you can just do a not rather than having it in here. It just keeps the code a bit neater and less stretched across your page. Anyway, check that out, Never Nester. If I remember, I'll link it in the description as well. So now we need to just handle if the build progression isn't finished, and we want to update our build progression mesh based on our new build progression. Now later on we're going to need a function to get the data from the buildable, so I'm just going to create that now because we'll need that later. It's not void, sorry. So that's just a getter for the data, so that'll allow us to extract the data from the buildable when we need it. And the other public function we're going to need is an update overlay material. So this will be when the build component's handling if we can place it or not. This will be what tells us. So we're going to pass in whether it can be placed or not, and then update the material accordingly. So this is where we need our dynamic overlay or dynamic material instance. If you have a look at we'll go into this material when we get into the editor, but there's a parameter in there called status, which we are going to update to essentially change the color of the update notification. And I'm going to make a change to this so it actually changes texture. But we'll do that once we get in the editor. So the only thing we haven't done is actually create our box collider at mesh components. So I believe we've got them set here. I'll just change these access parameters to the standard private component ones. And then we can go to the constructor. We don't actually need this to tick. I might turn that off for a bit of performance saving. Get rid of tick altogether. Did I do there? Go to bracket. So we're going to create our box collider, create our static mesh component, and then we'll put our box collider as the root component. And we're going to set the collision type to overlap all. So this will give us our event for overlapping things rather than, and it won't collide and stuff. So if you have other stuff that has physics on it, and that it won't be booting it around. And we want to attach our mesh to that root component, and we'll set the same collision to our mesh as well, just to overlap to make sure it doesn't affect any physics stuff in the world. And that should complete our buildable item or actor. So the next thing I want to do is create just a base class for the actual final building, because we don't want it to be a buildable, we want it to be just a normal class, so like everything would have a base class. So this one's a bit as per needed, but I want to be able to set the data on it, so I'm just creating a base class to be able to do that. Again, it's just going to be an actor, and I'm just going to call it S building base. And you might have base classes for multiple things if you've got different buildable types. Most likely, if you're going to have a bunch of different buildable types, it might be better to put this into an interface instead, so like a data interface, so you can just implement the set data function rather than add it to each base like this. But I've just got the one for this, so I'm just doing a class, so that'll allow us to set the data. So we'll just include forward decoration for our data asset, and then in our set data, try to move down here, we're going to need, before we can set it, we're going to need a reference to it. So I'm going to do, so I'll make this private and this protected. I don't know if we need to tick on this yet, but I'm going to leave it there. Add our mesh as the root component, just like we did for the buildable. And then in our set data, so when we set new data, we want it to update the mesh from the data at the moment. That's all we really need to do. So we'll just check the data is valid. We'll assign the data to that variable we just created. A validation if our mesh and our data are valid, then we'll assign the static mesh from the data. And doing the same thing, load synchronous. And if it's already loaded, which it should be from our, if it successfully built or whatever, then it'll just apply it, it won't reload it. That's all we need for those until we get into the editor. So now let's update our build component. A bit to add here. So again, we'll start with the variables. We're going to want a reference to the owning actor of the component, and we're going to want a world context because we're going to be spawning actors basically. That's what we're going to need that for. And then we're going to need a reference to the build object that we're currently building, and we're going to need another reference to the build object, but for the client only. We'll explain that soon. And they're both going to be our new buildable class we just created. We're going to need a bool for if the item's placeable or not that we're currently trying to place, and that should cover that. Now we want to update our placement status, so I don't think we've done that before. No. That can just be protected here. So this is going to tick over and say, can we place this object? So it's going to be this will be client side when we're trying to place something. So we want to check if the client build object's valid. And then we're just going to get, is there any overlapping actors? And that's is available in the actor class. And then if we do have overlapping actors, if we don't have overlapping actors, then this is placeable is true. And if it's not, then we need to call that update overlay material, either way we need to call it an update whether it's placeable or not. That'll update the overlay to have crosses or whatever, changes color or whatever you do with your material. So, like if it can't, it's red. If it can, it's green or something. Or maybe it's just nothing when it can. We just add, because this is something I know I'll forget, we declared that build object replicatable. So I'm just going to put that in here. So if you have a look, I should have pointed that out when I pasted that in, that it's replicated, the build object, not the client, because the client can just exist in the client. But when it's actually built, we want to, when it's actually placed, we want to pass it to the server so it can replicate it to all the players. So you can see, every player can see an item building, but not every player can see an item being placed. So now we need a function so we need a couple of functions to handle the deployment. One, we're gonna exit build mode, and we're gonna actually deploy the build. So this is to place it. This is to end the build mode, which is more like it's technically more like a placement mode. So here in the exit build mode, this is where we'll need to talk to the player controller and set our input. So I'm just gonna do a to do because we'll need to add our input to the player controller, which we'll do soon. So I'm just gonna put to do add input. So this would actually exit the input mode. So that what we're going to do is we're going to restrict the key binds to only being able to place, cancel, and move the camera around, rotate and stuff. So you can't do anything else while you're in the build mode. You can't accidentally click on things and do whatever. But the other thing we need to do is just destroy because we're not exiting, when we exit build mode, we don't want, like the thing we're trying to build connected to the mouse and moving around still. So we're just going to destroy that. And then on build, so for the build deploy, we're going to just check that we've got a current build object that we're trying to place. And we'll just confirm that it is placeable as well. So if it is placeable, that we can handle up in there. If it is placeable, we can handle the placement. I'm not going to do anything here, but I'll leave the option there. So you can here you could put. You might want to play a sound like it's not placeable. So like or something. Or you might want to call to your overlay material, make it flash red or something like that. So sorry, it should be can not build something like there. I haven't really included that in the tutorial, but that's where you could put it. And then we'll call our exit build mode here. We're going to need to call to the server here, which will be to deploy the actual build item. So we'll just add that, put that down here, and there's going to be a U function because it's going to be an RPC. So we're going to RPC to the server. We're going to send the data and the location that we want to do it because it's going to spawn the new actor. So this will be spawning a building base rather than a buildable. And if you don't have something that can automatically add, you need the implementation on the end for the RPC. And we're going to check that our build data coming through is valid. So the reason why we're not just referencing data, so we've passed the data through, checking it's valid. If it's not, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to force the spawn, so that's the spawn parameters. And then this is where we set our build object. So the build object is going to be a new spawned actor. Sorry, this isn't the completed build. This is the build deploy, as in it's going to start building. So it is a buildable. Sorry. So we're going to grab that the build class from the data. If you recall, we had the build class and the build class. That's what I was referring to. So this will be a building base, and this will be a buildable. You could change those there, but if you want to have this data work with different types of buildables, then just leave it as actor. And we're going to spawn it so this will be the location that we selected in the preview to start building. So now we need to set our new buildable up so it starts building. So we're going to initialize with the build state of building. If you recall, that'll start the setting all the meshes and doing what it has to do, reset the build progress, and then we're going to call the on build complete event here. Sorry, not call it. We're going to bind to it. So when it fires that delegate that we set up on our buildable, we want to come back and do the on build complete. So let's just create that function. That will need to be a U function as well because it's being called from a delegate. And we're going to pass back the build state. So we're going to need to reference our build data here because we're passing that state into this class. And this is so we can tell, so the build might be complete, but it could be aborted. That's why we're passing that state. So we just want to confirm that we actually have a build object because that's going to be what we're basing the data off. We're going to grab the data from the buildable. So if the build's complete, then we're going to call to the server to say, hey, this is where we spawn the final object, like I was saying before. Got a bit mixed up. And we want to send that to the server so the object is replicated. If you want anything that you spawn or create to be replicated, the server needs to handle it, so it's always going to be an RPC. But just before we go do that, we actually want to, if it's not a build complete and we've aborted, we actually just want to destroy the current build object. So You may want to change this if you want like a half-built building there, but you aborted it or something. But I'm just treating it as it wasn't built, it was cancelled, and we're getting rid of it. So let's do our server build complete function, and I'll put this under here again. RPC, the U function and server. We're passing in the same parameters, the data and location as before. So that should be all good now. So the difference is we're grabbing those from the build object this time and passing those along. So this is where we're using the world context and our owning actor reference. Technically our owning actor should be our player, but we're just using owning actor here because it's probably the easiest way to get the world context, which we'll set those references soon. But so this is where we've got to spawn. We want to spawn our actual final buildable class. So again, just going through the same spawn sort of setup, going to always spawn. We're going to get that built class from the data and load it. Sorry, I got the wrong name there. Drop the data for some reason. So if that's successfully loaded, then we want to spawn the object using that built class we got from the data at the location and those spawn params. And now this is where we'll go to our game state and update it with the struct that we created. So we're going to grab a reference to our game state using the gameplay statics, and we'll pass in the owning actor of this component to grab the game state. And then we're going to use that function that we created to add placed object. So we're going to create the struct with the build object and the owning player. And then here is where we'd either cast to our interface or our, in my case, I've done the building base and would set the data. So that would set up the mesh and apply the data to it. So the building can get all its stats from the data, whatever it needs from that data file. You can get abilities, it can get whatever you want. So what was the function? Still got to add the input. So in our tick, this is where we want to, we're not using a timer for this one, we're just going to do it on tick because it will be on the mouse, which needs to be quite fast. So we want to check that we've got a valid client build object, which we still have to create yet, we'll do that. But so I just need to update the mouse position, and because we've got to set our placeable to the mouse position. Now if you haven't done the previous tutorials, I'll just show you this on the player controller how to get the mouse position on the terrain. So if you haven't got that function, add that one. You can use the visible trace channel, just be aware you'll be able to put it on top of things, whereas this is a custom channel for just the terrain, so it'll go through other buildings, it won't go on top of buildings sort of thing and stuff like that. So that's our mouse position. Now if the mouse position has changed, then we want to just update it every time, to be honest. It's not going to really save them much. Still doing the cast every tick. But we'll update the location of the build object, and then we want to update the placement status, which is that checking for overlaps each tick and updating the material. So now we have this, we did this in the previous video, this enter build placement mode, and this is where we're telling the build component, we're telling the UI that we're entering build mode. But what we actually want to do here is, first of all, we'll just check, got a player controller reference, and then this we'll come back because this is where if you recall when we did the exit, not sure where the exit is, but in the exit one we set the input, so like set build mode input. So we'll change so we've only got the restricted keys to use. And then this is where we need to set up the client side placement. So let's do a function for that. And this is going to be an RPC to the client just to ensure that it is on the client and not the server. So same as the server, I'm just using the client and I'm prefixing with client just so I know it's an RPC to the client, and we're just going to pass the data. So in here, we're just going to check the things that we're going to be using again. And then I'm going to use a transform spawn actor here because later on we might want to change it so it rotates to the terrain. I'm not going to add that now, but we can look at that later. So that will spawn by transform, and then this is where we'll update the transform based on the terrain. So here we're spawning the actor and we're going to load the actual final build class. So we loaded the build class for the final thing, and this is just exactly the same as what we did before. It's just it's on the client only. So this will be the preview. There's 3 stages. There's the preview, the build mode, so it actually starts building and it'll grow with for meshes, and then the final is you spawn the actual final build object. And then we're going to call that a init function on the buildable, so that'll set all the data, and it won't start the build because we're not going to pass a build state, so it's going to skip straight to the preview. And then where we called this from, let's grab this, which is in the enter build placement mode here, pass the build data of what we want to preview, and then we'll move this on build mode entered, we'll move that into this function here, because that is for the UI, which is client side only anyway. So that saves us broadcasting that all over the place. Just to show you, so that's the event to broadcast it, and it's bound to UI only, just to double check. Right, so now we just need to set these references that we've been using. So we're going to do that in begin play. So we've got our player controller here, and we just want to add the owning actor and the world context. So we're using the owning actor to get the world context, and then we can update this with our world context as well. So just the world. And then we need to add to I've added that to tick. That's all good. So I think to finalize the build component, all we need to do is set up these input on the player controller. So let's do that. We'll go head over to our player controller. Actually, sorry, we'll start by setting up. If you followed the enhanced input setup, you'll have a data file be under input, and it's called player input actions. And we want to set up build mode set here. So I'm going to copy all of this. It's very similar to the placement one here. Could have actually used that, but I want to keep it separate. So I'm going to change this to build mode. The mapping context build mode. That priority will be the build mode priority, and this will be, we'll make this build deploy, because that's going to be when we place it down to start building, and this is going to be just build cancel. So that's the where we're going to reference our input actions and our mapping context, which we'll set those up in the editor and assign them to this data asset there. But in the player controller, so now we can go to our player controller. We need to, sorry, it's not player controller, it's player pawn. Player pawn is where we're doing the key bindings. There it is. So in here we have all our input keys, and we just need to set up 2 for our builds. So let's call this build mode again. And let's build deploy. Build cancel. So when these keys are clicked, it would be left and right mouse button, I guess, or whatever you set it to. All we want to do here is palm this off to our build component. So we're going to need a reference to our build component on our player pawn. So let's add a variable for that. We'll put this here where our reference to our player controller is. Because then we can use so wherever this gets set. So if we get a valid reference to a player controller, we can then use the player controller reference to grab that build component, and that was in begin play. So now, or both of these, we just want to check we've got a valid reference to our build component before we do anything. And then for build deploy, we're just going to pass the build deploy, and for build cancel, we're going to call the exit build mode. So the last thing to do for input in C++ is to assign the key inputs here. So again, I'm just going to copy this. It's going to be the same. So this will be build deploy, and build cancel, and build cancel. So now if we go back to our build component, we can update our to-dos. So no, we can't do that yet, because we do need to go to the player controller and add the actual input modes. So we need a build mode to set. We need to load the context. So let's go down to so we've got them here. So I'm going to duplicate again, and we're going to set input to build mode. We're going to copy it all again here, and we're going to just update this to, so we've got a reference for our player actions. We want it to be build mode, mapping context. Same with these. And this will be the build priority. And this is going to disable all the other keys. So the default key bindings will all be disabled and re-enabled when it's turned off build or we exit build mode. So now this is what we need to call from the build component. And that'll enter us into build mode and then exit build mode. And that's the reason why that's public, because it gets called from external. Call the same function, just with false to disable. Should be good to go into the editor now. So now we're in the editor. While we're on the input topic, we're going to continue with that. We're going to go straight to our actions. We only need to create the additional 2 actions, so I'm going to make a new folder for build. So we just need to deploy and cancel. So the input action, IA build deploy, and duplicate that and make it IA build cancel. Save those, go back. We need new context. So we're going to duplicate the default build because it has all the other keys that we want. Build our context to make context build. And then in here, all we need to do now is just remove the ones we don't want to use. So we don't need double tap. We want command, but it's going to be build cancel now. So that'll be, right mouse. Same with select. We want that. That'll be build deploy, be left mouse button. We still want to be able to move, still want to be able to zoom. We want to rotate. Yeah, we'll keep free look because that changes your angle, your pitch. Yeah, it looks fine. We don't want to be able to do the test. That's a key I set up for the placing units, so we don't want that. Unless you want to set up something where you can do different types of deployments, I don't really need any key modifiers, so I can remove all those. And that is our build mode keybinds. And then we just need to go to the data and add those new files. Build mode here. Oh, I forgot to change the category. I'll do that. So we've got the build context. I'll change the priority to 1 since we're never going to be in placement mode and build mode at the same time because you can't access placement from build mode. So that should be fine. And then this is build deploy and this is build cancel. Before I forget, I'll just go back. Doesn't really matter, it's just a cosmetic thing. But if you go to the data asset for input, I just didn't update this category here, so I'll just mood. Actually save this, we should be able to just do a live build. There we go. Now we need to update our build data, and I'm actually going to remove all these because I don't want to update every single one. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to not make the same mistake as the last video. I'm going to call it building 1. And so we have our complete mesh here, so I'm going to use the blue cube here for the completed one. Seem to be right. So we need to create some meshes for our build, and we'll do that. And we need to create our classes, and we need to edit our overlay material to be what we want. So let's start with creating these classes here, because I mean, the buildable we could just put straight in. We don't really need any blueprint class, but I'm going to create some anyway. So I'm just going to create a new folder, build. It's going to create the 2 blueprint classes in here. So just build, and this will be, just going to call it buildable. And then this next one would be a generic template class for any building. So it's going to inherit from that build base. So just build, and I'll call this building template. Save those. So you can see that there's nothing really to set in here because we're setting the mesh when we spawn it, so we don't need to touch anything. And if any of your buildings have other stats or data that it needs, then you put it in the build data file for it, apply it to this blueprint when it's spawned, or it's already there, it's in the data, so you can just reference directly to the data. You never have to actually modify this class. So say for example you had a building that needed a cost to it, so it needed 10 logs or something like that. You could create a parameter in your data, so in our build data that would be the cost to build, and then in your build class, rather than access some variable on the build class called cost, you just go straight to the build item to the build data and grab the cost from this data for that particular item. Anyway, let's throw these in now. So we got a buildable, and the final built thing will be the build template. So next we need to modify our overlay. So let's go into there. First thing I'll do is create a new material instance, and I'll call this overlay build, which that to my, and I'm going to bring in a texture for those crosses that I was using. So I don't have a texture folder. Create a texture folder. I'm just going to bring in a texture I just grabbed off one of the free PNG sites. It's a cross texture. Just going to rename that actually. So to call it T crosses, and I'm going to set it to displacement. Seems to get the transparency working properly. No idea why. That looks alright. So now we need to update our overlay material. So you can see that's the status variable I was talking about. It changes that from 0 to 1 to make it, hang on, I'm going to put this to 0. So that's one of the changes, put that to 0, which is makes it white. So this will now change it from green to red. I'm gonna bypass res null. I'll just disconnect it for now. Actually, no, I'll leave it in because it'll go funny. I'll just change this to 1, I think. So I just want to see it more. Basically making it much lighter effect. And then I want to get an alert in here. I want it to switch textures. So I want green to be arrows and red to be the crosses texture. So I might just duplicate this. And then this will be B, this will be A, and the alpha will be that status. So this I'll rename this texture to, and we'll call this top one texture success. So now if we bring that into the multiplier, oh, I didn't change the texture. So this would be our crosses. And if it's 0, it's the crosses, which are, I don't want them scrolling, so I just want them permanent. That's the changes. A little bit messy, but I'll do for now. In our instance, we can change the colors or change the textures to where we want it to be. So we'll assign that to our data, mi overlay build. And then the last thing to do is get our build meshes. So the way I'm going to do these, I'm just going to grab one of these and duplicate it. And this is what I'm going to use as my buildings. So I'm going to save this as a static mesh. So I'm having it selected in the editor, going merge actors. Merge is, that block's actually made up of multiple ones, but this is the way to export a static mesh anyway. I'll put it in the build folder for now, and I'll name this mesh. So I'll put it in a folder actually. I'll create a folder here called building 1. Like you'd have all different meshes for your builds, right? So if it was a building, it would have all different build stages of the different type of building. So this will be build stage 5. It's like the last stage. So that's that mesh. And then what I'm going to do is go to details. I'm going to drop the Z height here. So I'll go to 2. I'll go to 1.75, and then I'll export that again. Make that 4. You can see what I'm doing. Might make that a bit more. Make it 1. and that'll do. And that one thing that you might be noticing is this: the anchor point is in the corner, and the way we're doing it with the mouse is we really want it in the center at the bottom. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into, oops, we're going to go into the modeling tools here, and we want to change the anchor point. So it's under transform, there it is, transform pivot. So you can alter the pivot of an actor here. So I want it to be in the center at the bottom, and that's it. That's all I want to do. I'm going to accept that, and I'm just going to do that for each one. So I think it needs to be in the world. So just do it like that. Go pivot, center, bottom, center, oops, bottom. Oh, I forgot to accept. There we go. Center, bottom. So that's good. That one in. Pivot, center, bottom, accept. And the last one, pivot, center, bottom. Sorry, accept. There we go. And then we'll disable those. And we'll put them in our data. Oh, we can go back to normal mode now. We'll get rid of these in the world. Data. We're going to add them all into this array here. So it'll be build stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we need the final build. Oh yeah, we're using the cube, aren't we? Yeah, that's not going to work because it's not the right size. So what we'll do is we'll bring our final build stage in. We'll duplicate one of these because yeah, if we kept it as this, it would come up this small as the final build. So we don't want that. Let's just zero out this. When you have your proper meshes, you'll obviously be in the right size. So let's just save that one. Building 1, and this will be this is the building mesh. Building 1 mesh, let's call it. Save that. And then we'll add that into our data. So we need to change that to our new building 1 mesh. So now, if we get rid of these, our overlap isn't working. I'll check that in a second. Place isn't working either. What has happened here? What happened there? That's weird. So this has been annoying. I don't know what happened to this. But the reason why the overlap is not working, I must have dragged the whole map, did I? Everything's floating off the ground. I don't know what I did. But the reason why the overlap isn't working because none of these have overlap set. So if you come into the collision settings, where are we? Collision. None of this stuff in this default map. So if you're using this same map, you now need to go click on everything and change to generate overlap events because you need that on to, they both need to have that on to generate an overlap event. Super annoying, but I'm guessing Unreal didn't do it in this, so it's optimized as much as possible. The real annoying thing is you can't just control click multiple of these and change it to my knowledge. It takes away the static mesh here, so yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Same as these cubes here, they all need to have the static mesh needs to be set to generate overlap events. If you're not using this test map and you've got your own existing objects or whatever, and you don't want to go through and manually do it, if we jump back to C++, you can actually set that tick box to be enabled. So if we go say to our buildable, probably want to have it on. So we can go to our mesh or our box collider here and just go box collider, set generate overlap events to true. Like so. However, for the objects in this test map, they're all just place static meshes, so it's generating the actor for you. So you have to go in and manually change it. Kind of annoying. Once you've done that, I've been through and done that now. and I fixed up my platform here. But the just make sure you save, because the first time I did this, I changed them all, and then from the C++ from writer, I restarted the editor, and I just lost all my changes and had to go back and do it again. So annoying. Anyway, so we should get overlap events now. Yep, so we're getting the can't be overlapped, and we can place it. So, but I think our placement is still broken, so it's not spawning. So we're going to debug that. In here, I'm going to go into my build component, because this is where it handles deploying it. So we had a function here to build deploy. Here he is. Here, I don't know. I forgot to come back and add in the actual deployment call, the call to the deployment build. So that's quite an easy fix. So that's, we want to pass this to the server to spawn our build, basically. So we went and set up the function, but when I come back, I didn't put the function in here. So we're passing the client object's data and the client object's position. So that's our preview data and position. So let's give that a shot. We haven't messed up the pivot on one of the objects, if you notice that. And there we go, that's built successfully at least. I think it was the first one. Yeah, so let's go to modeling. I probably just forgot to click accept like I did a number of times. I nearly did it again. So, yeah, there we go, that pivot's good. Yep. Ta-da! We have a build. So now we could create, multiple builds for our list, and it will auto-populate by just creating the data for one. So if I just go, oops, in play mode. And there we go. So that concludes the build tutorial. There's probably still a few things that we can upgrade, such as deploying on slopes and terrains. I have covered that in the move marker tutorial, so you could probably grab the code from there if you want to jump ahead and do that. Please don't forget to like if you found this tutorial helpful, and subscribe so you don't miss out on future tutorials. You can join me on Discord or sign up to my Patreon, where you can get access to all my tutorials early and the project files, as well as gain access to behind the scenes on my current game development.